October 2014. The autumn air carried a crisp edge as morning fog rolled across the Kansas City metropolitan area, obscuring the sprawling urban landscape in an ethereal gray blanket. 3 unmarked police vehicles pulled into the parking lot of the Municipal Archives building on East 12th Street at exactly 8:47 a.m. Detective Sarah Martinez stepped out of the lead car, her breath visible in small puffs as she surveyed the nondescript brick building that housed decades of the city's forgotten documents. She had been investigating cold cases for 7 years, but nothing had prepared her for the phone call she received 3 days earlier from archivist Eleanor Hoffman. What began as a routine inventory of damaged records stored in the basement had transformed into a revelation that would reopen wounds that had never properly healed and shine light into corners of Kansas City's past that some had hoped would remain forever dark. The discovery was as unexpected as it was disturbing. While cataloging water-damaged documents from a burst pipe, Hoffman had uncovered a leather-bound logbook from the now-defunct St. Catherine's Home for Children, an orphanage that operated from 1952 to 1967 on the city's east side. The pages, yellowed and brittle with age, contained meticulous entries documenting not just the daily activities of the institution, but detailed records of incidents that painted a horrifying picture of systematic abuse. Most shocking of all were the entries spanning from March to August 1958, which described in clinical detail the treatment of children whose names had been reported missing during that same period, children whose disappearances had never been solved. The logbook represented the first concrete evidence linking St. Catherine's to a series of vanishings that had haunted Kansas City for 56 years. If you're interested in true crime cases that mainstream media overlooks, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for the detailed investigations you won't find anywhere else. The orphanage that would later become the center of this decades-spanning mystery was established in the wake of World War II, when Kansas City faced an unprecedented number of displaced and orphaned children. St. Catherine's Home for Children opened its doors in January 1952, housed in the imposing 3-story brick building on Prospect Avenue that had previously served as a tuberculosis sanatorium. The facility was run by the Sisters of Sacred Heart, a Catholic order known for their work with disadvantaged youth throughout the Midwest. Mother Superior Agnes Whitmore, a stern woman in her 60s who had spent 30 years in charitable work, oversaw an operation that was initially praised by city officials and local newspapers for providing hope to Kansas City's most vulnerable children. The logbook revealed that at its peak in 1957, St. Catherine's housed 87 children ranging in age from 6 to 16. The entries were written in a careful script that forensic handwriting experts would later identify as belonging to Sister Margaret Caldwell, who served as the institution's record keeper from 1954 until its closure in 1967. Her notations began innocuously enough, documenting mealtimes, educational activities, and medical appointments. However, as investigators would discover, embedded within these routine entries were coded references to what Sister Caldwell euphemistically termed special treatments and disciplinary measures that would later be recognized as documentation of systematic abuse. The building itself reflected the austere approach of its administrators. Former residents who came forward after the logbook's discovery described dormitories with 20 beds arranged in precise rows, communal bathrooms with no privacy, and basement rooms that were used for what the staff called reflection periods. James Morrison, who lived at St. Catherine's from 1955 to 1961, recalled the oppressive atmosphere in a 2014 interview. "You learned quickly not to ask questions or complain about anything. The sisters had their ways of keeping us quiet, and those ways got worse if you were one of the kids they didn't like." The orphanage operated with minimal oversight from city social services, a fact that investigators in 2014 would identify as a crucial factor in allowing the documented abuses to continue unchecked for over a decade. Kansas City in the 1950s was a community in transition, still recovering from the economic and social upheaval of World War II, while beginning to experience the prosperity and suburban expansion that would characterize the following decade. The metropolitan area had a population of approximately 456, Ziuzhou people, making it the largest city in Missouri and a significant regional hub for commerce and transportation. The political landscape was dominated by the remnants of the Pendergast political machine, which had controlled Kansas City politics for decades, but was beginning to face challenges from reform-minded civic leaders who promised greater transparency and accountability in city government. The social climate of the era was marked by strong deference to religious and institutional authority, particularly regarding the care of orphaned and disadvantaged children. Catholic institutions like St. Catherine's were generally viewed as benevolent organizations, staffed by dedicated individuals who had sacrificed personal comfort to serve society's most vulnerable members. This perception, combined with the limited resources available for governmental oversight of private charitable institutions, created an environment where facilities like St. Catherine's could operate with virtually no external scrutiny. The concept of children's rights as we understand it today was largely non-existent, and complaints from minors about institutional treatment were routinely dismissed as the fabrications of troubled youth who needed discipline rather than accommodation. The neighborhood surrounding St. Catherine's was primarily working class, populated by families of European immigrants and African Americans who had migrated north seeking better economic opportunities. Prospect Avenue itself was a busy thoroughfare lined with small businesses, modest residential buildings, and several other charitable institutions. The orphanage's imposing presence was both familiar and somewhat intimidating to local residents, who generally viewed it as a necessary but sad reminder of the social problems that affected urban communities. Few questioned what went on behind its brick walls, and fewer still would have felt empowered to intervene even if they had harbored suspicions about the treatment of the children housed there. The logbook entries that sent shockwaves through the Kansas City Police Department's cold case unit detailed a pattern of escalating violence that began in early 1958 and continued throughout that fateful summer. The first entry that caught Detective Martinez's attention was dated March 15, 1958, and described the admission of 12-year-old Thomas Patrick Sullivan, whose parents had been killed in an automobile accident on Interstate 35, just outside the city limits. Thomas was described in Sister Caldwell's precise handwriting as defiant and unsuitable for standard dormitory placement, language that the logbook revealed was consistently used to identify children who were subsequently subjected to increasingly harsh treatment. Thomas Patrick Sullivan had been born on September 3, 1945, to Irish Catholic parents Michael and Catherine Sullivan, who had immigrated to Kansas City in the 1930s, seeking work in the city's thriving meatpacking industry. Michael found steady employment at the armor plant, while Catherine worked part-time as a seamstress to supplement the family income. Thomas was their only child, born after Catherine had suffered 3 miscarriages, and by all accounts he was deeply loved and encouraged to express himself freely within the family's modest but warm household. Neighbors later described him as an intelligent and spirited boy who showed particular aptitude for mathematics and mechanical problems, often spending hours taking apart and reassembling household items to understand how they functioned. Standing 5 feet 4 inches tall with thick auburn hair that tended to curl when humid, Thomas had piercing green eyes that seemed to take in everything around him with intense curiosity. He had a lean build from playing neighborhood baseball and swimming in the Missouri River during summer months, and a distinctive scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident involving a bicycle and a particularly steep hill. His personality was marked by what his third-grade teacher, Mrs. Helen Rodriguez, described as an irrepressible need to understand the why behind everything, a trait that served him well academically, but would prove dangerous in the rigid environment of St. Catherine's. Thomas was the kind of boy who would ask you 10 questions about how something worked, and then come back an hour later with 10 more questions based on your answers, recalled neighbor Margaret O'Brien in a 1959 interview with police. His parents encouraged that curiosity, but I remember thinking at the time that he might have trouble in situations where children were expected to simply follow orders without explanation. His ambitions centered around someday becoming an engineer, possibly working on the construction projects that were beginning to transform Kansas City's skyline, and he had begun collecting technical drawings and mechanical diagrams that he kept in a wooden box under his bed. The family's routine in early 1958 had been stable and predictable, with Michael working the early shift at the packing plant and Catherine taking in sewing work that she completed while Thomas was at school. Sundays were reserved for Mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral, followed by visits with extended family, and Thomas had been looking forward to starting Little League Baseball when the weather warmed. The automobile accident that killed his parents occurred on a rainy Thursday evening as they were returning from a meeting with Catherine's doctor regarding some concerning symptoms that would later be identified as early-stage tuberculosis that went untreated due to the family's limited financial resources. The Kansas City of 1958 was experiencing significant growing pains, as post-war prosperity brought new challenges alongside economic opportunities. The city's population had swelled to over 475,000, straining infrastructure and social services that had been adequate for the smaller pre-war community. Housing developments were sprawling eastward and southward, creating suburban enclaves that drew middle-class families away from older urban neighborhoods, leaving behind concentrations of poverty and social problems that overwhelmed existing charitable institutions. The municipal government, still emerging from the corruption scandals that had plagued the Pendergast era, was struggling to establish effective oversight mechanisms for the numerous private organizations that provided social services throughout the metropolitan area. St. Catherine's Home for Children occupied a unique position within this landscape, serving as one of the few institutions willing to accept older children and those with behavioral problems that other facilities declined to handle. The building's location on Prospect Avenue placed it at the heart of a neighborhood that was becoming increasingly impoverished as middle-class residents relocated to newer suburban areas. The surrounding blocks contained a mixture of aging single-family homes, small apartment buildings, and commercial establishments that served the needs of residents who lacked the resources to shop in the more prosperous areas of the city. The social dynamics of the neighborhood were complicated by racial tensions that reflected broader patterns of segregation and discrimination throughout Kansas City. While St. Catherine's officially maintained a policy of accepting children regardless of race or ethnicity, the reality was that the majority of residents were white children from Catholic families with only token representation from other demographic groups. This composition reflected not just the preferences of the institution's administration, but also the broader social barriers that prevented equal access to services throughout the city's charitable network. Local law enforcement in 1958 consisted of a police department that was gradually professionalizing after decades of political interference and corruption, but still lacked the training, resources, and investigative techniques that would become standard in later decades. Missing persons cases involving minors were often handled with less urgency and thoroughness than similar cases involving adults, particularly when the missing children were already wards of institutions like orphanages or reform schools. The prevailing assumption was that such children had simply run away and would either return on their own or be picked up by authorities in other jurisdictions, rather than having become victims of criminal activity requiring immediate and intensive investigation. The logbook's March 18, 1958 entry provided the first detailed timeline of Thomas Sullivan's final documented day at St. Catherine's, a chronology that would become central to the cold case investigation that began 56 years later. According to Sister Caldwell's meticulous records, Thomas was awakened at 5:30 a.m. for morning prayers in the chapel, followed by breakfast in the communal dining hall at 6:15 a.m. Fellow residents later recalled that he had seemed unusually quiet during the meal, picking at his oatmeal and avoiding eye contact with both staff members and other children, behavior that was noted in the logbook as continued defiance requiring intervention. At 7:45 a.m., Thomas attended morning lessons in the orphanage's makeshift classroom, where Sister Mary Catherine taught basic arithmetic and reading to children aged 8 through 14. The logbook entry noted that Thomas had been disruptive during instruction and had been removed from the classroom at approximately 9:20 a.m. for what was described as individual counseling with Mother Superior. This session, according to the records, lasted until 11:20 a.m., after which Thomas was assigned to kitchen duties under the supervision of Sister Margaret Caldwell herself. The kitchen work continued through the lunch hour, with Thomas serving meals to other residents, while being denied food himself as part of what the logbook termed corrective fasting. At 2:30 p.m., he was observed by several other children working in the orphanage's vegetable garden, pulling weeds and preparing soil for spring planting. Sister Joseph, who supervised outdoor activities, noted in her contribution to the logbook that Thomas had appeared sullen but compliant during this period, suggesting that the morning's discipline had achieved its intended effect of breaking his resistant attitude. The final verified sighting of Thomas Sullivan occurred at 4:15 p.m., when he was seen by resident supervisor Brother Francis entering the building through the rear door that connected the garden area to the basement storage rooms. The logbook's entry for this time period was unusually brief, noting only that Thomas had been assigned to inventory and organization duties in the lower level of the building. No specific end time was recorded for these duties, and Thomas's absence from the 6:00 p.m. dinner service was initially attributed to his continued punishment, rather than any cause for concern. It was not until the mandatory evening count at 8:30 p.m. that staff members realized Thomas could not be located anywhere within the facility. A search of the building and grounds was conducted by Brother Francis and 2 older residents, but no trace of Thomas was found. Most significantly, the logbook entry for this search was added in different ink and handwriting, suggesting that it had been inserted some time after the original entries for that day had been completed, raising questions about the accuracy and completeness of the official record of events surrounding Thomas's disappearance. The discovery would transform how criminal psychology understood the intersection of authority and evil. Dr. Elizabeth Hartford, a renowned forensic psychologist who studied the case extensively, explained the psychological profile that emerged. Marcus demonstrated what we call compartmentalized psychopathy. He could genuinely grieve for Rebecca while simultaneously being her killer. His brain had created separate emotional compartments that never intersected. This wasn't simple deception. It was a psychological mechanism that allowed him to exist as both grieving community member and cold-blooded murderer. The evidence collected from his home painted a disturbing portrait of calculated preservation. Hidden behind false walls in his basement, investigators found what they termed a trophy room. 47 photographs of Rebecca, many taken without her knowledge in the weeks before her murder, lined one wall. Her missing silver bracelet sat in a glass case, positioned like a museum piece. Most chilling was a journal spanning 34 years, documenting his attendance at every memorial service, every family gathering, every community meeting about her case. The entries revealed his satisfaction at watching the family's pain, his pleasure in offering comfort, while knowing he was the source of their suffering. One particularly disturbing entry from 1989 read, "Attended Rebecca's birthday memorial today. Her mother looked so frail, so broken. I held her hand during the prayer. She thanked me for being such a faithful friend. The irony is exquisite." Another from 2003 noted, "Jennifer graduated today. Rebecca would have been so proud. I told the family this, and they smiled through their tears. They have no idea that Rebecca's final moments were spent looking into my eyes, realizing what I was going to do." The journal entries also revealed his methodology for avoiding detection. He had carefully studied every advancement in forensic science, adjusting his story and destroying evidence accordingly. When DNA testing became common in the 1990s, he burned several items of clothing. When digital photography made image enhancement possible, he destroyed several photographs from the original investigation that he had somehow acquired. His knowledge of investigative procedures, gained through decades of inserting himself into the case, had helped him stay ahead of detection. Detective Morrison, now leading the case after taking over from his retired predecessor, found the psychological warfare aspect most disturbing. Marcus had turned this family's grief into his personal entertainment. Every tear they shed, every sleepless night they endured, every moment of hope followed by disappointment. He had orchestrated it all while positioning himself as their greatest supporter. It's a level of psychological cruelty that's difficult to comprehend. The community's processing of this revelation created unprecedented psychological trauma. Dr. Sarah Chen, a trauma specialist brought in to counsel affected residents, described the collective response as betrayal trauma on a community scale. Hundreds of people had to reconcile their positive memories and interactions with Marcus against the reality of his crimes. Parents questioned their judgment in allowing their children around him. Church members felt violated knowing he had sat in their pews, participated in their rituals, while harboring such darkness. Local business owner Patricia Williams captured the community's struggle perfectly. You start questioning everything, every conversation, every kindness he showed, every time he helped someone. Was it genuine, or was it all part of some sick game? How do you trust your own judgment again when you've been so completely fooled? We all thought we knew him. We were all wrong. The revelation also illuminated how predators exploit small-town trust and familiarity. Marcus had weaponized the very qualities that made Millbrook special: neighborly concern, collective mourning, and community support. His presence at Rebecca's memorial services wasn't just cruel. It was strategically calculated to deflect suspicion and gather intelligence about the investigation's progress. When Marcus finally stood trial in September 2016, the courtroom was packed beyond capacity. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Rachel Thompson, presented a case that was both forensically airtight and emotionally devastating. The DNA evidence was irrefutable, linking Marcus definitively to the crime scene, but it was the psychological evidence, the photographs, the journal, the decades of manipulation that revealed the true scope of his crimes. Marcus maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings, his demeanor calm and controlled. When asked to explain the evidence found in his home, he claimed it was part of his own private investigation into Rebecca's murder. "I loved that girl like a daughter," he testified. "Everything I did was to try to find her real killer." The jury saw through his lies in less than 3 hours of deliberation. The victim impact statements delivered by Rebecca's family were devastating in their raw honesty. Jennifer, now 42 and a mother herself, spoke directly to Marcus. "You didn't just kill my sister. You killed our ability to grieve normally, to heal properly, to trust completely. You stole 34 years of our lives, making us dance to your twisted tune while you watched and enjoyed our pain. But your power over us ends today." Harold Miller, now 78 and using a wheelchair, had his statement read by his son-in-law. "I spent 3 decades blaming myself for not protecting Rebecca better. You watched me destroy myself with guilt, while knowing you were the monster I should have been protecting her from. You are not human. You are something much worse." The judge, the Honorable Margaret Foster, delivered a sentence that reflected both the original crime and the decades of psychological torture that followed. Life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 25 years for aggravated stalking and witness intimidation. In her sentencing statement, Judge Foster said, "Marcus Williams, you have committed crimes that go beyond the taking of one young life. You have terrorized an entire community for over 3 decades, weaponizing their grief and trust for your own sick pleasure. Society will be protected from you for the remainder of your natural life." The case's resolution brought both closure and new challenges for Millbrook. The town had to reconcile its identity with the reality that evil had lived among them, undetected, for so long. City Council member Robert Hayes reflected on this during a town hall meeting 6 months after the trial. "We can't let Marcus Williams define us or destroy what makes our community special, but we also can't pretend this didn't happen or that we shouldn't learn from it. We have to find a way to maintain our openness and trust while being more aware of the potential for deception." The Miller family established the Rebecca Miller Foundation for victims' families, focusing on providing support services for families of unsolved cases and funding advanced forensic research. Jennifer Miller Davidson became its executive director, channeling her decades of pain into helping others navigate similar tragedies. "Rebecca's legacy shouldn't be just about her death or even Marcus's capture," Jennifer explained. "It should be about how we can better support families living in the limbo of unsolved cases and how we can advance the science that eventually brought us justice." The Foundation's first initiative was funding genealogical DNA research for cold cases across the state. Within 2 years, their grants had contributed to solving 6 additional murders, bringing closure to families who had waited decades for answers. Harold Miller, in one of his final public statements before his death in 2018, said, "Rebecca is still saving lives, still bringing families peace. That monster thought he could destroy everything good about her, but goodness always wins in the end." The forensic breakthrough that solved Rebecca's case has since become a teaching tool for law enforcement academies nationwide. The combination of advanced DNA analysis, genealogical research, and cold case investigation techniques developed during the Miller investigation has been adopted as standard protocol for similar cases, Dr. Patricia Stone noted. Rebecca's case represents a watershed moment in forensic science. The methodology used here has been replicated successfully in hundreds of cases since then. Her death contributed to a revolution in how we solve cold cases. The psychological aspects of the case have also influenced criminal psychology research. Marcus Williams became a case study in long-term psychological manipulation and community-integrated psychopathy. His behavior patterns are now taught in forensic psychology programs as an example of how predators can successfully hide in plain sight for decades while continuing to traumatize their victims' families. For the residents of Millbrook, the case's resolution marked both an ending and a beginning. The fear that had lingered for 34 years was finally gone, but the community had to rebuild its sense of safety and trust. Memorial services for Rebecca took on new meaning, no longer gatherings overshadowed by the presence of her killer, but genuine celebrations of her life and legacy. The ripple effects continue to influence the community today. Parents are more involved in their children's activities, neighbors look out for each other more actively, and the police department has implemented community engagement programs designed to maintain awareness without fostering paranoia. Chief Detective Morrison, reflecting on these changes, observed, "We learned that vigilance doesn't have to mean suspicion, and community doesn't have to mean naivety. We can honor Rebecca's memory by being both welcoming and aware." As visitors to Millbrook today walk through the same streets where Rebecca Miller once lived and dreamed, they see a community forever changed by tragedy, but ultimately strengthened by its pursuit of justice. The park where children play bears a memorial plaque in her honor. The high school where she excelled displays a scholarship fund notice that bears her name. The church where Marcus Williams once sat in calculated deception now holds annual services celebrating the triumph of truth over deception. If you found this deep dive into Rebecca Miller's case compelling, please subscribe to our channel for more investigations into cold cases that have shaped communities and advanced forensic science. The intersection of human evil and ultimate justice continues to provide lessons for how we protect our communities while maintaining the trust that makes them worth protecting. Have you ever had your perception of someone completely shattered by discovering their hidden truth? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and remember to like this video if you believe every victim deserves justice, no matter how long it takes to achieve it. The investigation into the Saint Catherine's logbook would ultimately expose a network of corruption that extended far beyond the orphanage's brick walls. As Detective Martinez delved deeper into the records, she discovered that the disappearances weren't random acts of violence, but part of a calculated system that had operated with the knowledge and complicity of several prominent Kansas City figures. The entries revealed coded communications with individuals identified only by initials, suggesting that children from St. Catherine's were being systematically removed from the facility for purposes that the euphemistic language of the logbook barely concealed. Dr. Michael Harrison, a forensic psychiatrist brought in to analyze the psychological patterns evident in Sister Caldwell's writings, identified what he termed institutional dissociation in her meticulous record-keeping. She documented these horrors with the same clinical detachment she used for recording mealtimes and medical appointments, Harrison explained during a 2014 consultation with the police department. This wasn't the work of someone who was conflicted about what was happening. This was someone who had completely compartmentalized the abuse as just another administrative function of the institution. The handwriting analysis conducted by FBI specialists revealed subtle changes in Sister Caldwell's penmanship that corresponded with the escalation of documented abuse. Her normally steady script became increasingly erratic during entries describing what she termed special placements, suggesting internal stress despite her outwardly clinical approach. More disturbing was the discovery that certain entries had been written in advance, with blank spaces left for dates and specific details to be filled in later, indicating premeditation rather than spontaneous documentation of unexpected events. Thomas Sullivan's case became the focal point of the investigation, but he was far from the only child whose fate was documented in the leather-bound pages. Between March and August of 1958, 7 children were noted as receiving alternative placement arrangements that removed them from the general population of the orphanage. Unlike normal adoption or foster care placements, these arrangements involved no paperwork filed with city social services, no background checks of receiving families, and no follow-up visits to ensure the children's welfare. The pattern that emerged was chillingly systematic. Children selected for these alternative placements shared specific characteristics that made them particularly vulnerable. They were typically older children between the ages of 10 and 15, had no living relatives who maintained contact with them, and had been categorized in the logbook as disciplinary problems or unsuitable for standard placement. Most significantly, they were children whose disappearances would be unlikely to generate intensive investigation or public attention. Detective Martinez's team spent months reconstructing the social network that had enabled this system to operate. The breakthrough came when they identified one of the mysterious initials that appeared repeatedly in the logbook entries. RH was eventually connected to Robert Hutchinson, a prominent Kansas City businessman who had served on the board of directors for multiple charitable organizations throughout the 1950s. Hutchinson, who had died in 1983, left behind extensive personal records that his surviving family donated to the investigation after learning of the potential connection to the missing children. Hutchinson's private papers revealed a man whose public philanthropy masked disturbing private interests. His personal correspondence included letters discussing procurement services and specialized arrangements that aligned suspiciously with the timeline of disappearances from St. Catherine's. More damning were financial records showing substantial donations to the orphanage that were made outside normal charitable channels, suggesting payment for services rather than simple humanitarian giving. The investigation expanded to include other prominent figures whose initials appeared in Sister Caldwell's coded entries. J.M. was identified as Judge Marcus Thornfield, who presided over family court cases involving child custody and institutional placements. Thornfield's case files, stored in the same municipal archives where the logbook was discovered, showed an unusual pattern of expedited processing for paperwork related to St. Catherine's, including several instances where normal procedural requirements had been waived or overlooked. D.K. proved to be Dr. Kenneth Dolworth, a pediatrician who served as the orphanage's primary medical provider and who had signed off on numerous medical evaluations that deemed troublesome children suitable for specialized institutional care. Dolworth's medical license had been revoked in 1969 for undisclosed reasons, and his death in 1971 had prevented any investigation into his professional conduct. However, medical records found among his effects revealed patterns of unnecessary sedation and suspicious injuries among St. Catherine's residents that had never been reported to authorities. The scope of the conspiracy became clear when investigators realized that these men had not operated independently, but as part of an organized network that facilitated the trafficking of vulnerable children throughout the Midwest. Financial records showed a complex web of payments and transactions that moved money between legitimate charitable organizations and shell companies controlled by the conspirators. The system had been designed to provide legal cover for activities that would have been obviously criminal if conducted without institutional protection. Former residents of St. Catherine's who came forward after news of the investigation broke provided harrowing testimonies that filled in gaps left by the clinical language of the logbook. Maria Santos, who lived at the orphanage from 1956 to 1960, recalled the atmosphere of terror that surrounded children who were selected for special treatment. "We all knew that certain kids would just disappear," she testified in a 2015 deposition. "The sisters would tell us they had been adopted or sent to other facilities, but we never heard from them again. We learned not to ask questions because asking questions was how you got selected next." The psychological impact on survivors extended far beyond the immediate trauma of their experiences at St. Catherine's. Dr. Rebecca Chen, a trauma specialist who worked extensively with former residents, documented patterns of complex post-traumatic stress that had affected their ability to form relationships, maintain employment, and trust institutions throughout their adult lives. "These individuals weren't just abused as children," Chen explained. "They were systematically conditioned to accept that abuse as normal and inevitable, which created psychological damage that has persisted for decades." The investigation also revealed how the conspiracy had protected itself through strategic placement of its members in key positions throughout Kansas City's social services infrastructure. Judge Thornfield's influence over family court proceedings meant that complaints about conditions at St. Catherine's could be dismissed or buried before reaching higher authorities. Dr. Dolworth's medical evaluations provided scientific legitimacy for decisions to remove children from normal institutional populations. Hutchinson's business connections enabled the financial arrangements that sustained the operation, while maintaining the appearance of legitimate charitable activity. Physical evidence supporting the survivors' testimonies was discovered during a comprehensive search of the former St. Catherine's building, which had been converted to low-income housing in the 1970s. Ground-penetrating radar revealed anomalies in the basement floor that, when excavated, exposed a hidden room that had been sealed with concrete sometime in the late 1950s or early 1960s. The room contained restraining devices, medical equipment that had no legitimate purpose in a children's facility, and personal items that were later identified as belonging to several of the missing children. Among the most significant discoveries was Thomas Sullivan's wooden box containing his collection of technical drawings and mechanical diagrams, the same box that neighbors had described seeing in his bedroom at his parents' home. The box's presence in the sealed room provided concrete evidence that Thomas had indeed been held at St. Catherine's beyond his documented disappearance date, contradicting the official story that he had simply run away from the orphanage. Forensic anthropologists working in conjunction with the police department were able to recover human remains from beneath the concrete floor of the hidden room. While the advanced decomposition made positive identification challenging, age estimates and physical characteristics were consistent with several of the children documented in Sister Caldwell's logbook. DNA analysis using genealogical databases, the same technique that had proven successful in other cold cases, was initiated in hopes of providing definitive identification and closure for any surviving family members. The revelation of the St. Catherine's conspiracy sent shockwaves through Kansas City's religious and social service communities. The Catholic Diocese, which had maintained administrative oversight of the orphanage, launched an internal investigation that revealed systematic failures in supervision and accountability that had enabled the abuse to continue unchecked. Bishop William Crawford issued a public apology acknowledging the diocese's role in failing to protect the children under its care and announced the establishment of a victim compensation fund and mandatory reporting protocols for all diocesan institutions. The broader implications of the case extended beyond the immediate crimes committed at St. Catherine's. Investigators realized they had uncovered evidence of a trafficking network that had operated across multiple states, using various institutions as sources of vulnerable children who could be exploited without significant risk of detection or prosecution. Similar patterns were identified at facilities in Missouri, Kansas, and Iowa, suggesting that the Kansas City operation had been part of a much larger criminal enterprise. Federal authorities, including the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit, joined the investigation as evidence mounted of interstate trafficking activities. Agent Patricia Reynolds, who specialized in historical cases involving organized exploitation of minors, noted that the St. Catherine's case represented one of the most sophisticated and long-running operations of its kind ever uncovered. The level of institutional integration and legitimate business cover makes this case unique in our experience," Reynolds explained. "These weren't opportunistic predators. They were organized criminals who had systematically infiltrated and corrupted legitimate institutions to facilitate their activities." The investigation's impact on the surviving conspirators was limited by the passage of time. Robert Hutchinson, Judge Thornfield, and Dr. Dolworth had all died decades earlier, taking their secrets to their graves and leaving their victims without the possibility of confronting their abusers in court. However, several individuals who had served in supporting roles within the network were still alive, and criminal charges were filed against 3 men whose participation in the conspiracy could be proven beyond reasonable doubt. The prosecution of these elderly defendants presented unique challenges for the legal system. Defense attorneys argued that the advanced age and poor health of the accused made imprisonment inappropriate, while prosecutors contended that the severity of their crimes and the lifelong suffering of their victims demanded accountability regardless of the defendant's current circumstances. The cases generated intense public debate about the balance between justice and mercy in situations where decades had passed between the commission of crimes and their eventual prosecution. Public reaction to the revelations was marked by a complex mixture of horror, anger, and guilt. Many Kansas City residents struggled with the knowledge that their community had harbored such systematic evil for so long without detection. Community meetings were organized to allow citizens to process their emotions and discuss how to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The conversations often focused on the warning signs that had been missed or dismissed and the ways in which institutional respect had been exploited to enable criminal behavior. The case also prompted significant changes in how Kansas City and other municipalities approach oversight of charitable institutions serving children. New legislation required enhanced background checks for all staff members, mandatory reporting of suspicious incidents, and regular unannounced inspections by trained child welfare specialists. The reforms were named the St. Catherine's Protocol and have since been adopted by communities throughout the Midwest as a model for preventing institutional abuse. Educational initiatives were launched to help community members recognize the signs of systematic abuse and understand their responsibility to report suspicions to appropriate authorities. These programs emphasized that institutional reputation and community standing should never be used as reasons to dismiss concerns about child welfare, and that the protection of vulnerable children must always take precedence over the comfort of adults who might prefer not to confront uncomfortable truths. The memorial established for the victims of St. Catherine's became a focal point for healing and remembrance within the Kansas City community. Located in a small park near the site of the former orphanage, the memorial features 7 stone markers representing the children who disappeared in 1958, along with additional markers for other victims whose identities remain unknown. The memorial's design incorporates elements that symbolize both the loss of innocence and the hope for justice, serving as a permanent reminder of the community's responsibility to protect its most vulnerable members. Detective Sarah Martinez, reflecting on the investigation's conclusion, acknowledged that many questions would never be fully answered. The complete scope of the trafficking network, the total number of victims, and the specific fates of individual children remained partially shrouded in the deliberate obscurity that the conspirators had maintained throughout their operation. However, she expressed satisfaction that the investigation had succeeded in exposing the truth and ensuring that the victims' suffering had not been entirely in vain. The St. Catherine's case ultimately became a landmark in the evolution of cold case investigation techniques and interagency cooperation in addressing historical crimes involving vulnerable populations. The methodologies developed during the investigation have been shared with law enforcement agencies worldwide and have contributed to the resolution of similar cases in other jurisdictions. The case serves as both a cautionary tale about the potential for systematic abuse within trusted institutions and an inspiring example of how persistent investigation and community courage can eventually bring even the most carefully concealed crimes to light. For the families of the victims, the investigation provided answers that had been sought for more than half a century, along with the knowledge that their loved ones had not been forgotten and that their suffering had ultimately contributed to protecting future generations of vulnerable children from similar exploitation.